What if the city you were told would change your life is actually designed to quietly drain it instead? New York sells a promise so powerful that millions arrive believing they've finally made it, only to discover, slowly and painfully, that the reality feels nothing like the dream they chased. From the outside, New York is framed as opportunity in its purest form. Movies, series, social media, and decades of cultural mythology present it as the ultimate reward for ambition. Work hard, move fast, sacrifice a little now, and the city will give everything back to you later. That is the promise. But almost no one stops to ask a dangerous question before arriving. What if later never comes? The first shock isn't dramatic. It's subtle. It shows up in the noise that never stops, the constant urgency, the feeling that even standing still is a failure. People don't arrive and immediately say, "This place is broken." Instead, they internalize the discomfort. They assume the problem is personal, that they're not strong enough yet, not earning enough yet, not adapted enough yet. New York has a unique way of making systemic pressure feel like individual inadequacy. The promise suggests freedom, but daily life introduces a quiet form of captivity. Time is no longer yours. Space is no longer yours. Even rest feels conditional. Every moment carries an invisible price tag, and every decision is filtered through survival logic. Where you live, how long you commute, what you eat. When you breathe, everything is optimized not for living well, but for enduring longer. What makes this illusion so powerful is that the city never fully reveals itself at once. The glamour exists just enough to keep people believing. A skyline at night, a sense of proximity to success, the idea that something important is always about to happen. And so people stay. They adapt. They normalize what would feel unacceptable anywhere else. This is where the promise quietly breaks, not in a single moment of failure, but through accumulation. Exhaustion becomes a personality trait. Stress becomes background noise. Anxiety becomes proof that you're doing something meaningful. The city reframes pressure as purpose, and many accept the trade without realizing how much they're giving up in return. What no one tells you is that New York doesn't only test ambition, it tests psychological endurance. And the longer you stay, the harder it becomes to separate who you are from what the city demands of you. Leaving starts to feel like defeat, even when staying is clearly costing more than it gives. This isn't about disappointment, it's about misalignment. The promise was never built for most of the people who believed in it. And once you begin to notice that gap between what was sold and what is lived, it becomes impossible to ignore. Because the deeper question isn't why so many people struggle here, it's why the struggle itself has been rebranded as success. Before this goes any further, take a moment and ask yourself something honestly. How often do we consume stories about cities like New York without ever stopping to question the promise behind them? This video isn't about entertainment or easy opinions. It's about understanding a system that millions of people live inside every single day, often without realizing how deeply it shapes their mental health, their expectations, and their sense of self-worth. If this opening already challenged something you believed about New York, that reaction matters. Understanding comes before judgment, and reflection comes before change. That's why engaging with this content isn't just a formality. It's part of the process. When you leave a comment, you're not just helping the channel grow, you're actively participating in a conversation that most people avoid having. If you've lived in a big city, thought about moving to one, or felt the pressure of making it in an urban environment, write it down. Share a word, short sentence, or even just this phrase in the comments. The promise didn't match the reality. It helps signal that these experiences are not isolated. They're shared. And if this perspective feels different from what you usually hear, make sure to like the video and subscribe. Not for the algorithm alone, but because the next parts will go deeper into what daily life inside this system actually looks like, beyond the surface narratives. New York has been sold to the world as a machine that transforms ambition into achievement. If you are talented, disciplined, and willing to sacrifice enough, the city will reward you. That idea is repeated so often that it feels like a natural law, not a marketing narrative. But the deeper you look, the more this success factory begins to resemble something else entirely, a system that consumes far more ambition than it ever fulfills. The myth works because it uses exceptions as proof. A few visible winners, amplified endlessly, create the illusion that success here is common, attainable, and just one breakthrough away. But for every story that makes headlines, there are thousands of invisible lives operating at the edge of exhaustion, sustaining the city without ever being sustained by it. Their stories are not failures. They are simply not useful to the myth. What New York actually produces at scale is not success, but comparison. The city places people in constant proximity to symbols of achievement, wealth, influence, recognition, while quietly removing the conditions required to pursue them in a healthy way. Long commutes, unstable housing, unpredictable expenses, and relentless competition reshape ambition into anxiety. You are always close enough to success to feel it, but rarely stable enough to reach it. This is where the myth becomes psychologically dangerous. When effort does not lead to progress, people do not question the system. They question themselves. They work longer hours, accept worse conditions, and delay basic needs, convinced that relief is just one promotion, one client, one opportunity away. The city reframes structural barriers as personal shortcomings, and many internalize that logic without resistance. Another layer of the illusion is how success is defined. In New York, survival is often mislabeled as achievement. Being busy becomes a status symbol. Being overwhelmed becomes proof of relevance. Saying, "I don't have time," becomes a badge of honor. The city doesn't just demand productivity. It demands that you perform exhaustion as identity. Over time, this erodes perspective. People stop asking whether their lives are improving and start asking only whether they are falling behind. The myth doesn't collapse suddenly. It tightens. Each year raises the cost of staying while lowering the emotional return. And yet leaving feels unthinkable, because the myth insists that walking away means you weren't strong enough to win. But what if the real issue is that the game itself is designed to have far more participants than winners? What if New York's role is not to elevate most people, but to extract value from their time, labor, and psychological resilience while promising something it rarely delivers? Once you see the myth as infrastructure, not inspiration, it becomes harder to ignore its consequences. Because the city doesn't fail people loudly. It wears them down quietly, convincing them that this is simply the price of ambition. And that realization sets the stage for an even deeper question. What happens when living here stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like endurance? At some point, without a clear beginning, life in New York stops feeling like living and starts feeling like resistance. Not resistance in a dramatic sense, but in small, relentless ways that accumulate quietly. You wake up already behind on time, behind on rest, behind on money, behind on energy. And before the day even begins, the city has already set the tone. Keep moving or fall out of place. What makes this shift hard to notice is that nothing officially breaks. You still go to work, you still meet people, you still function. But your nervous system never fully relaxes. Every task is performed under invisible pressure. Trains might be delayed, rents might increase, jobs might disappear, and none of this feels exceptional. It feels expected. That's when resistance replaces living. In most places, stress arrives in waves. In New York, it becomes a baseline. Silence feels unnatural. Stillness feels unproductive. Even moments of rest carry guilt, as if you're wasting an opportunity you can't afford to lose. The city conditions people to treat exhaustion as discipline and anxiety as motivation. Over time, that reframing changes how people relate to themselves. A crucial turning point happens when people stop asking, "Is this sustainable?" and start asking only, "How long can I hold on?" That question marks the psychological shift from growth to survival. Ambition narrows, curiosity fades, life becomes transactional. Everything is measured against cost, time, and risk. Relationships become harder to maintain. Health becomes negotiable. Joy becomes postponed. What's striking is how normalized this state has become. People bond over stress. They joke about burnout. They compare how little sleep they got, how long they commuted, how much they're paying for less space. Suffering turns into a shared language, which makes it harder to recognize it as a problem. If everyone is struggling, then struggling must be normal. But normalization doesn't remove the cost. It hides it. Chronic stress reshapes perception. It shortens patience. It erodes empathy. It creates a constant low-level fear of falling behind, being replaced, or becoming irrelevant. And because the pressure never fully releases, people adapt by shrinking their emotional range. Feeling less becomes a survival strategy. Here's the quiet contradiction. A city built on intensity slowly drains the very qualities it claims to reward: creativity, resilience, individuality. When every decision is filtered through urgency, people stop experimenting and start preserving. They don't dream bigger. They manage damage. And that's when resistance becomes routine. This is not a failure of character. It's a predictable outcome of an environment that demands constant output while offering diminishing returns. And once resistance becomes the default mode of living, the next question naturally emerges. Who can actually afford to stay, and who is being pushed out without ever being told directly? New York rarely tells people they no longer belong. It doesn't announce expulsions. There are no public warnings, no official moments where the city says, "This place is no longer for you." Instead, it applies pressure slowly, incrementally, until staying becomes irrational. By the time people realize what's happening, the decision has already been made for them. This is how modern urban displacement works, not through force, but through math. Rent increases that outpace salaries. Neighborhoods that change faster than communities can adapt. Small inconveniences that pile up into permanent instability. Nothing feels dramatic enough to justify outrage, yet everything feels heavy enough to make life harder year after year. What makes this process especially insidious is that it's framed as progress. New developments are called revitalization. Rising prices are called market correction. Cultural erasure is called evolution. The language is clean, technical, almost neutral. But behind it is a simple reality. The city is reorganizing itself around who can afford to endure it, not who contributes to it. Longtime residents don't leave because they want to. They leave because the margins disappear. One rent hike too many. One commute that becomes unmanageable. One unexpected expense that breaks the balance. The city doesn't collapse for them. It quietly becomes hostile. And when they go, their absence is treated as natural turnover, not loss. What's rarely acknowledged is the psychological toll of this uncertainty. Living without stability forces people into constant calculation. Should I renew? Should I move again? Can I risk staying? Life decisions shrink into short-term survival strategies. Planning a future feels irresponsible when the ground keeps shifting beneath you. This pressure doesn't fall evenly. It targets those without buffers: artists, service workers, families, immigrants, middle-income professionals who once formed the backbone of urban life. The city keeps their labor, their culture, their energy, but removes the conditions that allow them to remain. They are essential until they're inconvenient. There's a quiet grief in this process that rarely gets named. Losing a city isn't just about geography. It's about losing routines, relationships, identity, and belonging. People don't just move away, they detach. And because it happens gradually, there's no clear moment to mourn it. What's most unsettling is how normalized this has become. Being priced out is treated as personal misfortune, not systemic design. Leaving is framed as a lifestyle choice, not a forced outcome. The city avoids responsibility by never saying the words out loud. And yet, the pattern is unmistakable. A city that grows wealthier while becoming less livable for those who keep it running is not evolving. It's narrowing. And once that narrowing reaches a certain point, the question is no longer who is leaving, but what kind of city remains. At a certain point, the systems that are supposed to support daily life in New York stop feeling reliable and start feeling improvisational. Trains run late, airports feel permanently overwhelmed, buildings age without care, and basic services operate on the edge of failure. Yet none of this is treated as collapse. It's treated as routine. That normalization is what makes the decay so difficult to confront. Infrastructure failure here is rarely spectacular. Bridges don't suddenly fall. Power grids don't collapse all at once. Instead, everything degrades just enough to remain usable, but never enough to be truly dependable. Elevators break and stay broken. Signals malfunction, and no one is surprised. Delays stack on top of delays, turning simple movements into exercises in patience and resignation. What's striking is how quickly people adapt. Missed connections become expected. Crowded platforms become permanent. Broken escalators become landmarks. The city conditions its residents to build extra time, extra stress, and extra tolerance into every routine. You're not supposed to expect efficiency. You're supposed to expect friction. Airports offer one of the clearest examples. They are gateways to the city's global identity, yet they feel chaotic, understaffed, and strained beyond design. Long lines, outdated terminals, constant construction that never seems to finish. These aren't temporary problems. They are symptoms of a system operating past its limits while pretending that inconvenience is just the price of scale. The same logic applies underground. The subway is framed as iconic, even heroic, despite being chronically delayed, overcrowded, and unreliable. When systems fail elsewhere, they spark outrage. In New York, failure is absorbed into culture. Complaints turn into jokes. Endurance becomes pride, and that pride quietly protects dysfunction. This matters because infrastructure shapes psychology. When basic systems can't be trusted, people carry that uncertainty everywhere. They leave earlier than necessary. They arrive already stressed. They plan defensively. Over time, this erodes any sense that the city works for you. Instead, you learn to work around it. The most unsettling part is that deterioration isn't accidental. It's the result of long-term neglect masked by constant activity. Construction becomes theater. Repairs are temporary. Investment prioritizes appearance over reliability. The city stays visually impressive while its internal systems quietly fray. And yet, very few people call this what it is, because acknowledging infrastructure decay would mean admitting that the city's promise is no longer backed by its foundations. It's easier to accept inconvenience than to question the narrative of global superiority. But once daily life depends on systems that barely function, another shift begins. Frustration stops being episodic and becomes ambient. And that sets the stage for something deeper, the moment when chaos itself becomes ordinary, expected, and emotionally invisible. There is a moment in every city where dysfunction becomes visible. In New York, that moment passed long ago. What replaced it wasn't outrage or reform, but adaptation. Chaos didn't disappear. It blended into the background of daily life until it stopped being noticed at all. Missed trains, overcrowded platforms, aggressive encounters, endless noise, unpredictable delays. None of this feels exceptional anymore. It feels expected. People adjust their behavior not to avoid chaos, but to coexist with it. They leave earlier, speak less, look down more, and move faster. Not because life demands it, but because the environment punishes hesitation. This normalization is one of the most powerful mechanisms of urban decline. When disruption becomes routine, it no longer triggers alarm. It becomes culture. You learn which lines are always late, which hours are unbearable, which areas require constant vigilance. You don't question why these conditions exist. You plan around them. And planning around dysfunction quietly legitimizes it. What's rarely discussed is how this affects social behavior. Constant exposure to friction reduces patience. Small irritations stack until empathy erodes. People become less tolerant, more guarded, more transactional, not because they are inherently hostile, but because the city trains them to conserve emotional energy. Every interaction carries potential stress, so detachment becomes a form of self-protection. There's also a subtle moral shift. Situations that would once provoke concern start to feel ordinary. Public distress blends into the landscape. Aggressive behavior is ignored. Overcrowding is accepted. When everything feels urgent, nothing feels exceptional. The city produces a constant low-level crisis that never fully peaks, and therefore never fully resolves. This is where normalization becomes dangerous. It removes the language needed to describe decline. When chaos is treated as just how things are, it stops being questioned. People stop imagining alternatives. They stop expecting better. The city's failures become personal inconveniences rather than collective problems. The irony is that New York still markets intensity as energy. Crowds are framed as vibrancy. Noise is framed as life. Speed is framed as ambition. But beneath those narratives is exhaustion. What's sold as excitement often feels like overload when you're living inside it every day. Over time, this environment reshapes identity. People become more reactive than reflective. They survive the day instead of inhabiting it. They adapt so well that they forget adaptation itself is a cost. And once chaos feels normal, recognizing decline requires a deliberate effort, one that many don't have the bandwidth to make. This quiet acceptance doesn't mean people are unaware. It means they are tired. And when fatigue becomes collective, the city enters a new phase, one where dysfunction no longer provokes resistance, only endurance. That's the turning point. Because a city that can no longer shock its residents with its own chaos has already crossed a line. And from there, the question shifts again, not to what's broken, but to who is quietly paying the price for pretending everything is fine. New York is often described as one of the wealthiest cities on the planet, a global capital of finance, culture, and influence. And on paper, that's true. Capital flows through the city at an extraordinary scale. Luxury towers rise, markets surge, fortunes are made. But alongside this concentration of wealth exists a parallel reality that rarely receives the same attention. A growing layer of invisible poverty produced not by absence but by proximity. This is not poverty in its most stereotypical form. It doesn't always look like homelessness or extreme deprivation. It looks like people who are technically employed but permanently insecure. People who earn too much to qualify for help, yet not enough to feel safe. People whose lives are one unexpected expense away from collapse. In a city this expensive, stability itself becomes a luxury good. What makes this poverty invisible is that it hides behind motion. People keep working. They keep commuting. They keep consuming just enough to appear functional. From the outside, they look integrated. But internally, they are rationing energy, delaying healthcare, postponing family decisions, shrinking their lives to fit the city's financial demands. The psychological toll of this condition is profound. Living in constant proximity to wealth amplifies comparison. You are surrounded by symbols of abundance while privately negotiating scarcity. This gap distorts self-perception. Struggle feels like personal failure rather than structural design. Many people internalize shame instead of questioning why a city so rich produces so much quiet instability. The city benefits from this arrangement. It extracts labor, creativity, and cultural energy from people who cannot afford to fully belong. Service workers, creatives, caregivers, educators, and mid-level professionals keep New York functional while being slowly pushed to its margins. Their presence is essential, but their security is optional. What's rarely acknowledged is how this reshapes the social fabric. When large segments of the population live in survival mode, trust erodes. Long-term planning disappears. Community weakens. People become transient not by choice, but by necessity. Relationships become temporary. Neighborhoods lose continuity. The city becomes efficient, but hollow. This form of poverty is especially destabilizing because it lacks visibility. There is no clear moment of collapse, only a gradual narrowing of options. People don't fall, they fade. They leave quietly, without protest, without headlines. And when they're gone, The city reframes their absence as mobility, not exclusion. Yet the contradiction remains impossible to resolve. A city cannot endlessly accumulate wealth while eroding the lives of those who sustain it without consequences. When affordability disappears, so does diversity of experience. What remains is a city optimized for capital, not for people. And once that balance tips too far, another shift occurs. The dream stops being about arriving. It becomes about escaping. Not because people failed, but because staying no longer makes sense. There is a quiet moment many New Yorkers reach, often without announcing it even to themselves, when the fantasy fully reverses. The dream is no longer about arriving, conquering, or staying long enough to make it. The dream becomes leaving, intact, sane, and before the city takes more than it gives back. What's striking is how rational this shift feels once it happens. Leaving isn't framed as failure anymore. It's framed as relief, as self-preservation, as clarity. People don't fantasize about penthouses or promotions. They fantasize about silence, space, affordability, and time that belongs to them again. The metrics of success quietly change. This reversal didn't happen overnight. It emerged as the cost-benefit equation collapsed. Higher rent didn't bring better living. Longer hours didn't bring stability. Proximity to opportunity didn't translate into access. The promise kept inflating while the lived experience kept shrinking. At some point, the numbers stopped working, emotionally, financially, psychologically. What makes this moment powerful is that it breaks a taboo. For decades, leaving New York carried a stigma. It implied you couldn't handle the pressure, couldn't compete, couldn't endure. Now, that narrative is eroding. More people are openly admitting that staying required sacrifices that no longer felt intelligent or honorable. This doesn't mean people stop loving the city. Many leave with affection, nostalgia, even grief. But love doesn't erase damage. And increasingly, people are choosing environments that support a fuller version of life over places that demand constant compression. They want room to breathe, not just to perform. The city itself reinforces this shift in subtle ways. Remote work exposed how much of daily suffering was location-based, not work-based. Other cities, once dismissed as secondary, began offering what New York could no longer provide: livability without erasure, time without constant urgency, cost structures that didn't punish existence. What's especially telling is who leaves first. Not the unambitious, but the reflective. Not those who failed, but those who calculated. Leaving becomes an act of discernment, not surrender. A recognition that success defined by endurance alone is a hollow victory. As more people reach this conclusion, the myth loses another layer of credibility. A city that once symbolized arrival now symbolizes extraction. And when escape becomes aspirational, the cultural meaning of the place fundamentally changes. But this raises an even more uncomfortable question. If so many people privately know the promise failed, why does the collective narrative remain intact? Why does the myth survive even as the exits grow more crowded? There is a quiet moment many New Yorkers reach, often without announcing it even to themselves, when the fantasy fully reverses. The dream is no longer about arriving, conquering, or staying long enough to make it. The dream becomes leaving, intact, sane, and before the city takes more than it gives back. What's striking is how rational this shift feels once it happens. Leaving isn't framed as failure anymore. It's framed as relief, as self-preservation, as clarity. People don't fantasize about penthouses or promotions. They fantasize about silence, space, affordability, and time that belongs to them again. The metrics of success quietly change. This reversal didn't happen overnight. It emerged as the cost-benefit equation collapsed. Higher rent didn't bring better living. Longer hours didn't bring stability. Proximity to opportunity didn't translate into access. The promise kept inflating while the lived experience kept shrinking. At some point, the numbers stopped working. Emotionally, financially, psychologically. What makes this moment powerful is that it breaks a taboo. For decades, leaving New York carried a stigma. It implied you couldn't handle the pressure, couldn't compete, couldn't endure. Now, that narrative is eroding. More people are openly admitting that staying required sacrifices that no longer felt intelligent or honorable. This doesn't mean people stop loving the city. Many leave with affection, nostalgia, even grief. But love doesn't erase damage. And increasingly, people are choosing environments that support a fuller version of life, over places that demand constant compression. They want room to breathe, not just to perform. The city itself reinforces this shift in subtle ways. Remote work exposed how much of daily suffering was location-based, not work-based. Other cities, once dismissed as secondary, began offering what New York could no longer provide: livability without erasure, time without constant urgency, cost structures that didn't punish existence. What's especially telling is who leaves first. Not the unambitious, but the reflective. Not those who failed, but those who calculated. Leaving becomes an act of discernment, not surrender. A recognition that success defined by endurance alone is a hollow victory. As more people reach this conclusion, the myth loses another layer of credibility. A city that once symbolized arrival now symbolizes extraction, and when escape becomes aspirational, the cultural meaning of the place fundamentally changes. But this raises an even more uncomfortable question. If so many people privately know the promise failed, why does the collective narrative remain intact? Why does the myth survive even as the exits grow more crowded? What makes New York's situation so difficult to confront is that it doesn't collapse in a way that feels cinematic. There is no single event, no definitive breaking point, no moment where everything clearly falls apart. Instead, the city enters a state of permanent decline that feels oddly functional. Things keep working, just badly enough to erode life, slowly enough to avoid rebellion. This is the most dangerous form of collapse, the kind that disguises itself as continuity. The trains still run, but unpredictably. Jobs still exist, but without security. Neighborhoods still stand, but without community. On the surface, the city appears alive. Underneath, it is thinning out, socially, psychologically, structurally. What's being lost isn't just efficiency, but coherence. Daily life becomes fragmented. People live in pieces, work here, sleep there, commute endlessly in between. There's no center of gravity, no sense that the city is organized around human rhythm. Instead, everything is organized around throughput, moving people, money, and attention as fast as possible regardless of the toll. This slow collapse is hard to resist because it never demands a response. Each problem feels manageable on its own. A little more rent, a little less space, a little more stress, a little less time. Individually, these adjustments seem survivable. Collectively, they reshape an entire way of life into something narrower, harsher, and less forgiving. Over time, expectations shrink. People stop asking for comfort, stability, or meaning. They ask only for access and endurance. The city doesn't promise happiness anymore. It promises relevance. And many accept that trade, even as it costs them health, relationships, and long-term vision. What's most revealing is that this process doesn't affect everyone equally. Those with capital can insulate themselves. Those without must absorb the friction directly. The city becomes a machine that rewards distance from its own consequences. And that separation makes the decline harder to see from the top, while impossible to ignore from the bottom. New York still represents something powerful in the global imagination. But symbols can outlive substance. The danger is not that the city will suddenly fail. It's that it will continue like this, indefinitely, extracting value while offering less and less in return until the gap between image and reality becomes impossible to bridge. At that point, the promise doesn't collapse loudly. It simply fades. And what remains is not the city people dreamed of, but the city they learned to tolerate. If you're still here, it means this wasn't just another video for you. It means something in this story connected with your own experience, your own doubts, or your own questions about life in big gay cities like New York. And that matters more than you might think. If you've ever lived in a major city, thought about moving to one, or felt the pressure of chasing a promise that didn't fully deliver, take a second and write this in the comments. The promise didn't match the reality. Those words help show that this isn't an isolated feeling. It's a shared experience. If this analysis helped you see urban life from a different angle, make sure to like the video. Not as a habit, but as a signal that this kind of deep, honest conversation about modern cities deserves space. And if you want more content that questions urban myths, exposes hidden costs, and looks at the human side of structural decline, subscribe to the channel. There's another video on your screen right now that continues this discussion and goes even deeper into the realities of modern urban life. Watch it next, because understanding how these systems work is the first step to deciding whether they truly work for you.